Welcome to the Women's March Canada podcast, making the equality of women in Canada the new norm. This is episode 43, entitled In Defense of Rights. My name is Leanne Castellino, inspiring, uniting, and leading the charge for the advancement of women across Canada. Please welcome our guest this week, Kyla Lee. Kyla is a criminal defense attorney based in Vancouver, British Columbia. Her areas of expertise include drinking and driving laws, spousal assault, fraud, and police procedure. She's a graduate of UBC Law with degrees in First Nation Studies as well as English literature. Kyla is also of matey heritage. Thanks so much for joining us today, Kyla.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start, first of all, with what inspired and triggered your interest in criminal law?
I think it was a sort of a lifelong interest. Criminal law intersects with people in so many interesting ways. And so the things that I studied in my undergraduate degree, especially with First Nation studies, my studies focused on identity, but also on youth and criminality. And so it just sort of naturally led into an interest in criminal law.
Now, you specifically have a broad area of expertise as it concerns driving offenses in this country. What led to that?
It was sort of a happy accident. I started articling at a firm that dealt specifically with driving law, and I just found that it was a really natural fit for me. I enjoy driving law. It's a good area to litigate charter issues because surprisingly, in driving law cases, charter issues come up more frequently than other types of cases. So you actually get to do constitutional litigation and arguing about people's rights being violated more than you would in other sort of classic criminal senses.
That's really interesting. Is there a case that you oversaw that you can give us an example of exactly what you're talking about?
Well, I guess sort of my biggest achievement would be a case that I did at the Supreme Court of Canada, which is called Wilson in British Columbia Superintendent of Motor Vehicles. And it's about in British Columbia, we have a very specific piece of legislation related to drinking and driving. And it's about the interpretation of that legislation and how I argued how it should be interpreted to best protect people's rights in the criminal driving sphere. I wasn't successful, unfortunately, but it was a huge opportunity and something I wouldn't have had if I'd been in another area of law.
So then tell me, what trends or patterns have you noticed since you've been practicing in terms of driving offenses in this country?
I think a big trend that we've been seeing is a shift away from sort of this focus on individual rights and protections of people's liberties on the road, and more of a focus on the protection of society. And while that sounds positive, because obviously keeping our roads and highways safe is an important issue, I think we've gone almost too far towards the protection of society, and we've forgotten about core charter values that affect people. And with Bill C-46 and the changes to the impaired driving law that are coming about alongside cannabis legalization, that raises very big concerns for me about people's charter rights. And because the law has shifted away from protection of individual liberties, it opens up a huge potential for marginalized groups like women, like Indigenous people, like people of color, to be exploited or to have their rights violated more significantly under this legislation.
So do you see that pendulum swinging to more of an equal balance at some point, and what will it take to make that happen?
I think it's going to have to, and it's going to take some litigation. It's also unfortunately going to take cases with the right facts, which means we're going to have to see people having their rights violated, and people are going to have to be in that position to say, this is too much and we need to put a stop to this.
So what would you say to a client then that, let's say, is part of one of the a marginalized group, or women, First Nations, whatever that group is, about like what advice would you give them if they have a case but maybe are fearing that they are going to be marginalized?
I think the best advice is, if you find yourself in a situation, roadside with the police and you don't know what's going on, ask to call a lawyer. And after you're done dealing with the police, when you've been released, call a lawyer right away and find out what your options are. It doesn't have to be me, but call somebody. And there's lots of people out there who can help.
Have you seen that kind of exploitation happen in your practice so far?
Yes, unfortunately I have. And it's always incredibly frustrating. And it's hard to stay objective, but because I'm a woman and because I'm Métis, when I see racism and sexism impacting people's treatments, it really makes it hard to stay objective as a lawyer. And it's also frustrating as a member of society because we don't want to see this. And I also find that police are very defensive as an organization when you say, this situation was an example of racism or sexism. Sort of police generally say, whoa, wait a minute, we're not racist and we're not sexist. And they're afraid almost to identify the individuals within their organizations who police using those criteria because they're worried that it's going to taint the whole organization.
So interesting. So we live in a world of cameras everywhere all the time, 24/7. Is that a good or bad thing in your line of work, specifically the types of area of law that you practice and what you just described? Is that an advantage or a disadvantage as a lawyer?
It's a little of both. I mean, police body-worn cameras, in-car cameras, and cameras at police detachments are excellent at sorting out what really happened because they're an objective record of the event. So, I mean, you can have somebody saying, I don't think that I was fairly treated, and the camera can show they were fairly treated, they were just upset about the outcome. Or alternatively, you can have some really awful conduct exposed. And so it's a good balance that way. But I do have concerns about the overuse of cameras. And it's actually interesting that you mentioned cameras because right now there's a big debate about red light cameras and using those to measure speed and bringing back photo radar in British Columbia. And a lot of people are upset at the idea of being policed by cameras. So I think we have to recognize when we're using cameras in policing and in law enforcement, sort of that balance between protecting the people who are dealing with the police, but also not invading everybody's privacy and not turning this into a nanny state.
We are on the cusp of cannabis laws coming to effect in this country. Do you anticipate any kind of an impact on your practice in particular?
I think there'll be an increase in the amount of work I deal with. We're going to see a lot more cannabis and drug-impaired driving investigations because the police are being given new tools to deal with drug-impaired driving and new training to deal with it. The other thing I think we're going to see is an increase in sort of constitutional challenges to these laws because at the same time as legalization, we're getting this overhaul of all of our impaired driving laws. And that's going to make my work really, really interesting, but it's also going to make the work that I do more important because it has the potential to affect everybody in significant ways. So it's kind of a huge responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Why would you say that you're passionate about what you do?
Sorry?
Why would you say that you're passionate about what you do?
I don't know. I just love what I do. It fills me with joy to do the legal work that I do. I think that I'm working in an area where people are, my clients, often drunk drivers, are sort of stigmatized. They're labeled as bad people. Oh, you could have killed children, or you did kill children, and that has the huge potential to impact people. And I think also the work that I do might not be important to society as a whole most of the time, but it's very important to the individuals that I'm protecting. And so it makes me feel like what I'm doing is valuable.
What would you say are some of the challenges that you face as a female in a largely male-dominated industry?
I think it's a lot of challenges about being taken seriously. I've had to work a lot harder than my male colleagues to sort of be respected in this field, and to get the attention of judges, and to get good reactions from other defense counsel or other prosecutors about my position on cases. And it's subtle. Like, it's not like anybody's, well, I mean, sometimes they are, but most of the time people aren't overtly sexist, but it is subtle. Sometimes you go into a courtroom and somebody says something to you about what you're wearing, or you're asking another lawyer. I mean, this is an example I had. I was asking another lawyer who was constantly exceeding his time estimate if he could just stick to his time estimate so we could complete our case. And he responded with, "Yes, mom," which I thought, you would never say that if I were a male lawyer. And it's just those little things, but they wear you down. And I don't see men in the courtroom and in the legal profession having to face that. I don't see them having to answer for their gender at the same time they're answering for their client and answering for their behavior.
So then how do you counter that? Does that impact you in specific ways in terms of how you conduct yourself, how, let's say, aggressive you are in your approach or not? Like, how does that impact you?
I mean, it actually probably mitigates my aggression in cases. I sort of play off people's expectations by trying to sometimes fill that more expected feminine role, and using the aggression or the sort of the more typical male behavior to surprise people, like in cross-examination or something like that. But I think it also makes me work harder, which has been more beneficial to me. I mean, I'm more likely to shamelessly self-promote and put myself out there and ask for opportunities, because they're not going to come to me as easily as they're going to come to men. And in the end, it's worked out to be a benefit, and it's certainly helped to advance my career. But I think I think I wouldn't have had to work that hard had I been a man.
So then, have you succeeded, would you say, or have you tried to change perceptions? And have you seen a change in the time that you've practiced, let's say, with some of the lawyers that you've seen over time?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I've worked really hard. I've been practicing for a little over 6 years now, and I think I've earned myself a seat at the table by demanding that there be one for me and forcing my way in.
How about your matey heritage? Has that ever been a detriment or some kind of liability to you in your career?
I don't think so. And I think I'm fortunate, and this sort of goes back to what I studied with my First Nation studies and the identity politics. I'm fortunate to present as non-Indigenous. So I look white and I blend in and I get to hide in plain sight. And it's been something that I've been able to use to my advantage, because you would be surprised at the conversations that people will have when they think that you're one of them, and the incredibly racist things that people will say to your face because they think that you are on their weird racist team. And then it's, I can store this information and use it later, or I can confront them and say, hey, I happen to be Métis, and then, they get a 10-minute lecture on history or whatever the case may be. But it's I've used my privilege of having this white skin to my advantage, and been able to take advantage of that. So I haven't found that it's been detrimental.
Okay. What would you say are the top 3 myths around driving offenses in this country, and what would you say to dispel them?
I guess the biggest myth is that the police have to have some reason to pull you over. They do not. The police can pull anybody over to check sobriety, licensing, or driver fitness, or insurance, which basically means random traffic stops. And I think people, when they operate under the understanding that police can just stop anybody, but they have to have a reason, they're less willing to accept that we have targeted race-based harassment in traffic stops. And so I really work hard to dispel that myth. The other big myth is about a beer an hour. A lot of people believe you can have one beer an hour and drive safely. And if you are a 150-pound male, only men, or heavier, you can do that for your first 2 drinks. But after that, it starts to catch up with you. And for women, unfortunately, impaired driving laws and per se limits, so like the 80 milligrams of alcohol and 100 milliliters of blood limit, is kind of sexist, because our bodies will have a higher blood alcohol concentration with less liquor, just because of how our bodies process alcohol, even though the impairment won't be the same. And so I think women need to be educated on these myths in particular, because they don't apply to us at all. And I guess the third one is that you have the right to refuse to take any breath or blood samples, or ask for an alternative. Like if you're asked for a breath sample, say, no, I can have a blood sample. That's not your right. If the police demand that you provide a sample, you're legally obligated to do so. And people who operate under those myths are so frequently charged with refusal to blow offenses that I really wish there was more public education about refusal offenses so that people could know.
Yeah, I was going to ask you just on that note, like, do you think where are we in terms of that public education piece? Like,
we're way behind where we need to be. Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't realize the impact that it has on them when they don't keep apprised of the law. But there's so much to know when it comes to driving law, and it's such an ever-changing area of the law that it makes it really hard to educate the public. And I think the government isn't doing enough to educate, particularly about refusal to blow.
How would you go about conducting that kind of education? Where should it be happening?
It should be part of the messaging that they give when they give anti-impaired driving campaigns. I mean, they say don't drink and drive, and they have all these ads on TV and posters and bus ads and things like that. They should also have in their education about refusal to blow and the consequences of that, so people know what their legal obligations are.
Mm-hmm. Is there a need, going back to something we were talking about a bit earlier that I wanted to just touch on again, is there a need, in your opinion, to make the playing field more level for women in law, whether they are lawyers, as yourself, and as you say, if they are the actual clients? Definitely that you had said yes to earlier, but as a practicing lawyer, is there a need to make it more level?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, we see women leaving the legal profession at higher rates than men. 5 years in, we're outnumbering men in first-year law, but 5 years, we're way less than men retained in the profession. And I think the profession doesn't account for unique needs that women have as far as their obligations with family and raising children, but also because of sort of this historical sort of ingrained male-dominated profession, there isn't space for women. I mean, a good example of this is the courthouse I was in recently in Vernon. There was a male barrister's room, which is a room where lawyers can go to relax in court breaks or on the lunch break, or to do some research, and also to change in and out of their lawyer robes. And it was nice. It had couches. It had lots of lockers to store your belongings. And the female barrister's room was in the basement. It was around the corner from a courtroom. It was a plastic card table and 2 lockers. And somebody's empty Tim Hortons cup. Nobody was even like keeping it clean. And it's just, that's consistent. We're in courthouses all over the place. The space that they created originally was only for men, and so they had to find a closet and convert it into the women's space. And you just don't feel welcome when this is supposed to be your space and it's an afterthought.
So what would you say to a young individual female watching this who aspires to be a lawyer and is inspired by what you've said, but then also knows the reality of the situation currently in the industry? What would you say to inspire them?
Push your way into a space, make space for yourself, because people will move out of your way because they're not expecting you to do that. And I think it takes people aback, but it also makes them stop. And lawyers by and large are intelligent people, and it makes them step back and take stock of where they are and go, wait a minute, this is wrong. and we do need to make space here. And I think speaking up about that is the best way to make change. And you are going to find a lot of people who are resistant, but you are also going to find a lot more people who are willing to help you along.
Terrific advice. Kyla Lee, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Your comments are always welcomed and encouraged. Please subscribe to our Women's March Canada podcast channel and receive updates every time we upload a new podcast or video. Our mission across Canada is to stand together in solidarity with our parents, with our partners and children for the protection of rights, our safety, our health, and our families, recognizing that our vibrant and diverse communities are the strength of our country. This is the Women's March Canada podcast. You can find us on Twitter at Women's March CDA or our website, womensmarchcanada.com. My name is Leanne Castellino. Thanks so much for joining us and have a great day.